Hey, Modern World History students. We are continuing with unit number 9A, the Cold War in Europe and Asia, and this is section number 11, Communism in China. So you'll remember that after a long civil war, separated by the Japanese invasion and occupation of China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, had defeated Kuomintang, also called the Nationalists, and had driven them completely out of China off to the island of Taiwan. And Mao Zedong, the leader of the CCP, had established a new government in China called the People's Republic of China. And that in 1949, China then, the world's most populous country, had become a communist country. So today's lesson is all about how Mao transformed China into having a communist economy and really into a totalitarian society. So I hope you'll be able to explain how Mao Zedong began to transform Chinese society and the Chinese economy in the early years of the People's Republic of China. And here you'll learn about indoctrination, Mao's 5-year plan, which begins with land reform. And then I hope you'll be able to explain why Mao's Great Leap Forward failed and why the Cultural Revolution only made things worse. So here you'll learn about the Great Leap Forward and the famine that it caused. You'll hear about the Cultural Revolution, Mao's cult of personality, the Little Red Book, and the Red Guard. So let's go back to October 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And here we're at the top of page 15. So when Mao first established the People's Republic, you've got to remember that for over 2,000 years, Chinese society had been governed, had been ordered according to really the writings of one man. And that man's name was Confucius. So Confucius, who was known in China as Confucius, was one of China's earliest philosophers. And he had written 2,500 years almost in the past about the proper way to order a society. He talked about how society had 5 different relationships: the husband to the wife, the parent to the child, the sibling to the sibling, the neighbor to the neighbor, and the ruler to the subjects. And he had said that in all of those relationships, there were sort of unwritten rules that needed to be followed. But that if everybody followed those unwritten rules, you could establish sort of perfect or ideal relationships. And if everybody truly was following those unwritten rules, and you had ideal or perfect relationships throughout society, you could have an ideal or perfect society, a society that runs smoothly, a society that is harmonious and peaceful. And the number one rule that Confucius presented was, don't do to other people what you would not have done to you, which is a kind of a different formulation of what Christians call the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have done to you. These two ideas existed at the same time in very different parts of the world. But Mao Zedong, of course, did not like Confucius, because in Confucius's sort of vision of society, there were relationships that were that implied sort of inequality. And remember that communism does not tolerate inequality. And also, Mao Zedong did not want people clinging to old ideas. And the ideas of Confucius were very old ideas. He wanted people to think according to the ideologies of communism only. And so the first thing that Mao Zedong began after establishing the People's Republic of China was to begin the process of indoctrinating the Chinese people. Now, you understand the word doctrine. You've heard that before. You may have heard of the Monroe Doctrine, maybe in 8th grade. We talked about the Truman Doctrine earlier. So a doctrine is a set of beliefs. And you remember when Harry Truman stated his Truman Doctrine, the first 2 words out of his mouth were, I believe. I believe the United States should commit itself, blah, 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 right? So a doctrine is a statement of belief. To indoctrinate someone is to basically take your beliefs and plant them into somebody else. To take your beliefs and the way that you think and force someone else to think that way, force someone else to believe that way. So what Mao wanted to do was indoctrinate the Chinese people with the beliefs, the ideas, the values of communism. The problem was that for 2,000 years, they had been somewhat indoctrinated with the philosophies of Confucius. So he needed to root out Confucius's beliefs and, in their place, install the beliefs of communism. So, for example, he abolished the teaching, he banned the teaching of Confucius and Confucius's philosophies, which was astonishing because the entire Chinese education system was built around the ideas of Confucius and teaching those ideas and indoctrinating Chinese students with those ideas. And what this meant was that all of the works of Confucius, all of the writings of Confucius, all of the copies of Confucius's writings had to be collected and destroyed. And there were mass book burnings throughout China where the writings of Confucius were burned so that they could not be studied any further. And it meant that the entire Chinese education system had to be disrupted and uprooted, and the curriculum transformed into one that praised communism and taught the beliefs, the doctrines of communism instead of Confucius. This was a difficult process, as you can imagine, particularly in a country of 600 million people, to uproot all of the old ideas, the traditional ideas that had really governed China and Chinese society for 2,000 years. And so Mao did what so many totalitarian dictators do. He took control of all the media. He took control of all of the newspapers and the publishing houses, which published books, and all the electronic media, such as it was in China, like radio stations, and later on television as well. And so just like in Lenin and Stalin's Russia or Soviet Union, just like in Hitler's Germany, just like in Mussolini's Italy, all of the ways of disseminating information, all of the media, the newspapers, the book publishers, all of that now came under the control of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And the first thing they did, of course, was to eliminate references to Confucius. And then they replaced it with communist propaganda to install into people's minds the beliefs, the values of communism. They also then, as we already kind of suggested, they completely transformed the educational system, and its curriculum became centered around indoctrinating Chinese children with the beliefs of communism as well. Now, while that process was going on, Mao was also seeking to transform China's economy. And as a communist, of course, he believed in equality. He believed in establishing equality amongst all of Chinese people. And China, the vast majority of China's population, kind of like the vast majority of Russia's population, when they had their communist revolution back in 1917, the vast majority were peasants. Peasants who owned no land. That's what made them peasants. China, prior to the coming of communism, had been a feudal society because the Chinese emperors, in order to gain protection for themselves and to gain the loyalty of the powerful families, had given to those families huge tracts of land in return for their loyalty and in return for their protection. Well, remember, that was true in Russia as well prior to communism. The great mass of people owned no land. They were peasants who were really forced to work on the land of the big wealthy landowners. That was true in Russia before the revolution there. It was true in China before the communist revolution succeeded in 1949. So the first thing that Mao Zedong did was he took all of the lands in China away from the wealthy landowners, the wealthy nobles. And in the process of doing so, ordered the deaths of many of those wealthy landowners. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed during the process of land reform. Because what Mao encouraged peasants to do is not just take the land, but then accuse the landowners of various types of abuses or violations of their rights. And as a matter of fact, many of the large landowners really were rather abusive people. They did abuse their power over the peasants, and the peasants suffered because of it. And now Mao proclaimed it was time for the peasants to sort of have their day. And as a result of Mao's encouragement and of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party's encouragement, between 500,000 and 1 million landowners were murdered during this time. And all of their lands were seized by the peasants and distributed to the peasants so that they could produce their own grain and sort of make a living for themselves. However, that particular arrangement didn't last long because Mao was a communist, but he was also a modernizer. For him, the entire point of communism was that he believed that it would be an effective way to modernize China. He wanted China to become a modern country, an industrialized country, a country that could defend itself, protect itself against the influence of foreign countries. Because you have to remember that all through the 19th century and into the 20th century, China had not been strong enough to resist the intrusions by foreigners, interference, influence of foreigners. And of course, the invasion by Japan had just been the worst case of that. So Mao really wanted to modernize China. That was the point of introducing communism. And so Mao was looking for models on how to rapidly modernize, rapidly industrialize a country. But he didn't have to look far because the Soviet Union had modernized very, very rapidly during the period of Stalin's rule, right? Stalin had taken over in 1924. He had set a goal to modernize the Soviet Union in a period of 10 years so that it could resist a future invasion, so it could survive the next war. And Stalin had succeeded. And although it was extremely costly in terms of human life, Stalin, remember, had taken the Soviet Union from 16th in the world in manufacturing to second in really a period of just about 15 years. So Mao was looking at the communist model of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And of course, at this time, it was 1949, Joseph Stalin was still alive in the Soviet Union. He was still leading the Soviet Union. And so Mao chose to adopt Stalin's 5-year plan idea for trying to rapidly modernize China. And so he very quickly shifted from land reform, where he simply gave land to the peasants and said, okay, this is your land now, go make a living for yourself. He shifted over to collective farming. So following the model of Joseph Stalin, here we go, he took the peasant farms, which were, of course, tiny little farms because each peasant sort of had their own farm. And like Stalin did, he collectivized them. He created large farms that were shared by groups of peasants, and he sought to introduce newer farming techniques, more modern farming techniques. They didn't have a lot of newer technologies that they could introduce, although they were about to get some. But the idea was that they would make the farms more efficient by having larger farms with modern techniques and eventually modern technologies as well. Now, you remember that went over very badly in the Soviet Union. And as a matter of fact, Stalin's introduction of collective farming in the Soviet Union led to a massive famine. That did not happen, however, in China, at least not initially. And the reason why is that Mao did not take all of the surplus. He did not take all of the surplus away from the peasants. Remember, the problem with Stalin's approach to collective farming was if you produced any additional grain above and beyond the bare amount that you needed to survive, Stalin or the Soviet government was going to take that and sell it and use the money to build factories. And so it really disincentivized production. Peasants lost the motivation to produce because if they produced any extra, they didn't get to keep it, right? It didn't benefit them to produce any extra. And so that's what led to a collapse of agricultural production in the Soviet Union. In China, that didn't happen. Mao Zedong did not take all of the surplus from the peasants. And so the peasants in China did not lose their incentive. They did not lose their motivation to produce. They kept on producing. And so collective farming did prove to be more efficient. And it actually did result in increased agricultural production during those first 5 years of Mao's 5-year plan. You say, well, wait a minute. Mao's goal is to modernize China, which means to industrialize China. He's going to want to build steel mills and electrical power plants, things like that, just like Stalin did in his 5-year plans. Well, that's true. So you say, well, where did China get the money for that? If the reason why he took the surplus grain from the peasants was to sell the grain and make money to build factories, how are the Chinese going to get money to build factories and build electrical power plants if they're not taking the surplus grain from the peasants? And the answer was that the Chinese had something that Stalin never had, and that was support from Stalin. So the Soviets were very excited about China's communist revolution, as you can imagine. Um, China's communist revolution was the first one in the world that was sort of a native-grown communist revolution other than the one in Russia. Remember, when communism took root in Eastern Europe, it was because the Soviet army had invaded Eastern Europe at the end of World War I, and they had installed communist governments there. Communism in Eastern Europe had been planted there by the Soviets. But in China, communism had come about through a natural process, a revolution of Chinese resulting in a communist government and a communist system there. That was very exciting to the Soviets, to have an ally in communism, to have the world's most populous country, a neighbor, have a native-born, natural communist revolution. That was very exciting and gratifying to the Soviet Union. And so Joseph Stalin was favorable to supporting China in their process of becoming industrialized. And so the Soviet Union signed a treaty with China in which they not only pledged to support each other militarily, but a treaty in which the Soviet Union pledged to support China economically, to support China's process of modernization, of industrialization. And so, whereas Stalin in his 5-year plan had to take all the surplus grain from the peasants and sell it in order to make money to build factories, Mao didn't have to do that. Part of the reason there was no famine at this time in China was that Mao didn't have to take the surplus grain from the peasants to sell to make money to build factories. The Soviet Union provided pretty generous financial support to China to help them build their factories. And by the way, this is part of the reason why the Soviet Union did not have any money to rebuild Eastern Europe. Part of the reason why Eastern Europe stagnated under Soviet rule was that what money they did have available, they were putting into helping China modernize and industrialize. So China really benefited not only from the financial support that they received from the Soviet Union, but also they received technical support. 50,000 Chinese traveled to the Soviet Union to study how Soviet steel mills operated, how they were managed, how Soviet electrical power plants operated, how they were managed. And some 12,000 Soviet advisors traveled to China to supervise the construction and the initial operation of steel mills and electrical power plants in China. So the Chinese propaganda poster that you see in the lower right-hand corner depicts one of these Soviet advisors explaining to two Chinese engineers, here's how we do this. Here's how you operate your steel mill. And so China really benefited during its 5-year plan. Mao really benefited. His process of modernization and industrialization moved forward very quickly initially because they had support from the Soviet Union, both financial support, money, and technical support, know-how. And Mao didn't have to cause a famine in order to make this happen because he was able to leave the peasants alone to do their collective farming work. He wasn't taking their surplus in order to pay for modernization. So the first 5-year plan was really successful in China. Now look, some surplus grain was taken in order to compensate the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was also given a lot of China's mineral resources in compensation for their assistance. So the Soviet Union did get some stuff out of this other than just being gratified at helping the other world's first communist country to succeed. But it wasn't enough to really disrupt China's economy or plunge China into a famine, the way Stalin had experienced. So China really experienced quite a bit of growth in those first 5 years. There was increased agricultural production, and you had all these steel mills and electrical power plants and factories being built. So the first 5 year plan was very successful. The downside of it was that the support that the Soviet Union gave to China was great to cause rapid growth at the beginning and to really give China a kickstart to their industrialization and modernization process. But unfortunately, in the long run, China didn't really have the resources or the know-how to really build on that growth and multiply that growth by themselves. And the problem was they were about to attempt to do that. So I'm moving you down to the bottom of page 15. So in 1953, Joseph Stalin died. And the leaders of the Soviet Union who followed Joseph Stalin were not really nearly as enthusiastic about supporting China as Joseph Stalin had been. They wanted to keep China as an ally. They wanted to support China, but they had other problems to deal with. The lack of growth in Eastern Europe was increasingly a problem, and that focused a lot of the Soviets' attention as some of those revolts began to break out that we talked about. Some of those revolts against communism in Eastern Europe were starting to happen. And at the same time, Mao was ready to try to have China go out on its own a little bit. Mao didn't want China to have to depend upon the Soviet Union forever. He was grateful for the support that the Soviet Union had provided up till that point, but he didn't want to have to rely on the Soviet Union, and it was clear that the Soviet Union wasn't looking to support China forever either. And so Mao announced an initiative called the Great Leap Forward. And the idea of the Great Leap Forward was that China would now continue its modernization process without assistance from the Soviet Union, that China was now ready to move forward and try to continue modernization and industrialization, and that China could do it all by itself. One of the first things that Mao did was relocate millions of Chinese peasants to the big cities because he needed labor for these new steel mills and electrical power plants and factories that had been built with the assistance of the Soviet Union. He wanted those operations working sort of around the clock, 24 hours a day, to crank out steel and manufactured goods and produce electrical power. And the problem was that the cities in eastern China simply didn't have sufficient population to make that happen. So Mao began a process of literally transplanting, of relocating millions of Chinese peasants from the countryside out to the big cities in order to provide labor for his steel mills, electrical power plants, and factories. Peasants were essentially kidnapped and loaded into buses and trucked out and to become factory workers, steel mill workers. Now you say, well, this is a problem. I mean, you are pulling all of these peasants, you're pulling all of these agricultural workers off the fields. You're going to suffer a decline in agricultural production. But Mao wasn't worried about that because collective farming had been quite successful. It had actually resulted in increased agricultural production. And now, with the support of the Soviet Union from years, the immediate years past, and with factories up and operating, he could now provide to the collective farms the modern technologies, not just teaching them modern techniques, but now giving them modern technologies, like the tractors that you see here being introduced to one of the collective farms. So he said, look, yes, we are removing millions of peasants from the collective farms and moving them out east to work in the factories. However, we are now providing the peasants who remain behind on the collective farms, we are providing them with modern agricultural technologies. We're providing them with tractors and things like that. And they will now be able to become even more efficient, even though they don't have as much labor. And that's true. In modern farming, a lot of labor is replaced by introducing new technologies. Here in the United States, we took the American West and turned it into an agricultural breadbasket. Not by sending more people out there, although people had to go, but by introducing new technologies. And so Mao was right that you could you could have fewer farm workers and yet produce the same amount of agricultural goods, produce the same amount of food, same amount of grain. You could do that by introducing technology. The British had done that during the Second Agricultural Revolution too. So Mao wasn't wrong about that. Introducing new technologies would allow China's collective farms to continue their growth in agricultural production, even while millions of peasants were pulled out to move east and work in the factories. But here's where he ran into a problem. Now, he did begin taking the surplus. He needed to. He couldn't let the peasants keep the surplus anymore. He had done that during that first 5-year plan. He had allowed the peasants to keep any additional grain that they produced, because he didn't need to take it, because the Soviets were providing the financial support for building the factories. He took some of it, but not all of it. The problem was now he needed to take the surplus, not to sell it, but to move it to the east to feed all the people who were in the cities. Because, of course, all those peasants who had moved into the cities to work in the steel mills and the electrical power plants and the factories, they were no longer producing their own food. And so the problem was, in collective farming, yes, you had made farming more efficient, you had given the peasants new techniques and new technologies to farm more efficiently, but now we get back to the problem of incentive. Now Mao is going to take whatever surplus is produced in the collective farms and take it out east to feed the people in the cities. And what we learned, from the Soviets is it's not just technique and technology that determine how productive you're going to be in agriculture. Incentive, motivation counts for so much. And taking away the peasant surplus, saying, okay, thanks for producing all that grain. Now we're going to take a bunch of it and feed these other people out in the cities who I moved out there. That now disincentivized agricultural production, and the peasants lost their motivation. And here we go. You might have predicted agricultural production in China now collapsed. Despite the efficiencies introduced by collective farming and these new technologies and these tractors, agricultural production collapsed. And you now have what's called Mao's famine. So China suffered what was known as Mao's famine. And again, just like Stalin continued to take the surplus and sell it, even while his own people were starving, Mao continued to take grain from the collective farms and move it out to the east to feed the people in the cities. Of course, he had to. At least he was feeding it to his own people. But that meant that many of the peasants in the countryside began to starve and die. And, Lenin's famine had killed 10 million people, and Stalin's famine had killed 15 million people. Mao's famine may have killed as many as 20 to 30 million people. In the meantime, the steel mills were producing steel in the cities, but not as much as Mao had hoped. And so Mao got this crazy idea to encourage the peasants out on their collective farm. Oh, by the way, not only are you farming, but we want you to build your own furnaces, become known as backyard furnaces. We want you to build your own furnaces, and we want you to collect like junk goods, like old broken agricultural tools. You have tractors now, so you don't need your old hand tools. Old useless cooking pots that maybe had holes in them and things. So Mao encouraged people out in the countryside, the peasants, to build furnaces and fire them with coal and take all of this old scrap steel that they had lying around in the form of old tools and things and melt that steel down to produce more steel, because the steel mills in the cities were producing a lot of steel, but not as much as Mao hoped. And so now he wanted to mobilize the peasants to also melt down old objects to produce more steel. Well, this was a disaster, because the quality of the steel that the peasants were producing in their backyard furnaces was very, very low. In fact, it turned out not to be useful for any major industrial grade applications. You couldn't use it to produce rails for railroads or machines for factories or steam engines to power electrical power plants. It was low-grade steel that was coming out of these backyard furnaces, and the coal that was being diverted to fuel these backyard furnaces was needed in the steel mills to produce good steel. And instead, there was a coal shortage in China because coal that should have been sent to the steel mills to produce good quality industrial grade steel wasn't being sent there. Instead, it was being used by peasants to produce low grade steel that was almost useless, and a lot of it ended up just getting dumped in junkyards. So, Mao made lots of decisions during the Great Leap Forward that were they were sort of radical decisions. And in a lot of ways, they didn't pay off very well. And the result was massive suffering, mass starvation amongst the Chinese people. And in some cases, the wasting of important vital natural resources like coal to produce steel that in the end was useless. So now I'm taking you to the top of page 16. So as a result of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, for the first time, people actually began to criticize Mao Zedong. He had not really experienced that before. He had been the great leader who had brought about a victory in the revolution, in the Civil War, and he had had great success in those first 5 years at increasing agricultural production and forging a partnership with the Soviet Union and beginning the process of industrializing and modernizing China. And so there had not been a lot of criticism of Mao. But now, with the failure of the Great Leap Forward, starting in which was very clear, by 1960, it was very clear that the Great Leap Forward had been a failure. Now, for the first time, people began to criticize Mao Zedong and criticize and at least question and cast doubts on the wisdom of his policies. If they didn't criticize him directly, they were criticizing his policies and his decisions. And Mao was the kind of person who simply did not tolerate that. And so starting in 1964, Mao struck back against criticism. Mao was not the kind of person who was willing to learn from criticism. He was not the kind of person who was willing to accept criticism. Starting in 1964, he struck back against this criticism. First of all, through the publishing of a book called The Sayings of Chairman Mao. And it was better known simply as the Little Red Book, because hundreds of millions of copies, there were 600 million people in China at the time, hundreds of millions of copies of this book were published with this sort of red plastic cover featuring Mao Zedong. So although it was officially called The Sayings of Chairman Mao, it was better known simply as the Little Red Book. And it was full of Mao Zedong's wisdom on really everything, from revolution and politics and governance all the way down to personal hygiene, and day-to-day life. And this was supposed to be sort of your handbook for living. As a person living in the People's Republic of China, the Little Red Book was to be your handbook for living. And you were supposed to carry it with you wherever you went. And you were supposed to sort of memorize the passages. You were supposed to memorize the sayings of Chairman Mao so that you sort of constantly had them on your mind to guide you in every aspect of your daily life. Like I say, everything from personal hygiene and how to carve a turkey, all the way up to revolution and war and governance and political life. So the Little Red Book was part of an effort to continue that process of indoctrination, to embed in people's minds the ideas of Mao Zedong. And increasingly, it wasn't the ideas of the Communist Party, but of Mao himself. And what happened is Mao became the embodiment of the Communist Party. Mao was not simply the leader of the Communist Party. The Communist Party was a party of Maoism. And there actually began a phrase at this time, Mao Zedong thought, which was a form of philosophy. And so Mao was no longer following so much the beliefs of communism, but communism was being reshaped, at least in China, to follow the beliefs of Mao. It was Mao Zedong thought. It was his beliefs that now were adopted by the party. Mao was not following party's beliefs and values. The party's beliefs and values were being reshaped to fit him. And so this was the beginning in China of what's called a cult of personality. So you know what a cult is. It's a group of people who are sort of radical followers of a particular set of beliefs. When you have a cult of personality, what people are following is not so much a set of beliefs, but a person. And they adopt that person's beliefs. They believe in that person, so they adopt and they follow that person's beliefs the way that they would follow a religion. That's how a cult of personality works. You are so devoted, so adherent to one person that you follow their beliefs as if their beliefs were religious beliefs. So Mao deliberately cultivated, right? He deliberately created this cult of personality in which he was to be viewed as the embodiment of communism, the embodiment of revolution, and as the sort of perfect leader, almost taking over the way that Chinese thought of their emperors back in ancient times. And you can see here, we have in both of these, both on the cover of the Little Red Book and this propaganda poster, we see Mao presented as the shining sun, the rays of the sun emanating from him. He is the source of light. He is the source of energy. Everything revolves around him. And so he was presented as a person whose ideas were perfect and whose ideas should not ever be disputed because he was the perfect leader, the perfect thinker. His thoughts were perfect. And that was how it remained for the rest of Mao Zedong's life. This cult was built around following him, and his beliefs were the Communist Party's beliefs. His ideas were the Communist Party's ideas, and they were to be followed without any kind of diversion. In 1966, then, Mao doubled down on his efforts to crush critics through the introduction of what was called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And we can simply call it the Cultural Revolution, as most people do, the Cultural Revolution. Now, this sounds like something exciting. Culture, we think of, language and religion and music and dance and foods and things like that. But that's not what this was. This wasn't some sort of celebration of Chinese culture. The Cultural Revolution was an effort by Mao Zedong to silence his critics once and for all. And he recruited from amongst the younger generation to be sort of his avengers in amongst the Chinese society. The problem was that the older generation had grown up without communism, whereas the young and without indoctrination. So they weren't quite as committed as Mao saw it. They weren't as committed as to communism as the younger generation were. By 1966, that younger generation had grown up with Mao as their leader. Mao had been in charge for 17 years by 1966. And this generation of people had grown up with their schools, indoctrinating them with the beliefs of communism, but also with the cult of personality of Mao. So whereas an older generation of people were not as committed to him, not as devoted to him, the younger generation, as he saw it, was. So he mobilized the youth. He basically shut down China's education system. From middle school, high school, and universities were basically shut down. And the students were recruited into what was known as the Red Guard. And the Red Guard's job was to basically serve as a kind of an army of enforcers who would go around within Chinese society and basically root out anybody who was seen as a believer of the old ways. That is, anybody who was a counter-revolutionary. So a counter-revolutionary against the revolution. Well, anybody who was sort of critical of Mao was now seen as a counter-revolutionary against the revolution, because Mao was the embodiment of the revolution. As a result of this cult of personality, Mao was the embodiment of the revolution, the embodiment of communist beliefs, the perfect leader. And any person who was critical of Mao, any person who cast doubt on Mao's ideas or his policies, was seen as a counter-revolutionary. And it was the Red Guard's job to root these people out. So they would stop people on the streets, just randomly. You could be stopped on the streets, and a group of Red Guard would demand that you recite from memory the passages from the Little Red Book. You see them here carrying the Little Red Book. So a Red Guardsman might appear to you and say, "What does Chairman Mao say about the proper way to baste and stuff a chicken?" You know, and you would be expected to recite that word for word from memory from the Little Red Book. And if you couldn't do that, they would beat you up. You'd be physically attacked and beaten up. And any person who was seen as being critical of Mao or casting doubt on Mao or his beliefs or his policies was attacked by the Red Guard. They were publicly humiliated, like you see these people here, made to stand on these chairs in a very sort of uncomfortable position with these signs hung around their heads saying what their offenses were. And then after a long period of public humiliation, they were often beaten, attacked by the Red Guard, beaten up. This man appears to have had his nose broken, his hair torn out, and many of them ultimately were executed. The Red Guard tied their hands behind their back, put them on the ground, put pistols to their heads, and shot them in the back of the heads. And during this time, who knows how many people were killed? The estimate is somewhere between 1 to 3 million people. And this was all part of Mao Zedong's effort to silence his critics. And the thing is that a lot of the people who were killed by the Red Guard, they were skilled people. They were, university professors and even government officials who had the gall to disagree with one of Mao's policies or to suggest that one or the other of Mao's policies had been incorrect policies, failed policies. Of course, they had been failed policies, but speaking the truth like that could get you labeled a counter-revolutionary and killed. And between 1 and 3 million people were killed by the Red Guard during this time. It is said that the Cultural Revolution probably set China's development back 20 to 30 years, because an entire generation of knowledgeable, smart, good people were killed or silenced. And then this younger generation was basically denied an education because Mao had shut down the education system so that they could go out and attack his critics as Red Guardsmen. So one generation of people with special knowledge and skills was silenced or killed, and another generation never really developed because they were denied the education to grow those knowledge and skills. So many people would say that the Cultural Revolution set China's development back 20 to 30 years, that China could be 20 to 30 years ahead of where it is today had it not been for the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution continued until Mao Zedong died in 1976. Well, that's all for now. Take care of yourselves. As always, stay healthy and safe. We'll talk to you again soon. So long, modern world history students.